Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ron Klein, and as chair of the Jewish Democratic Council of America, I want to welcome you to today's conversation. 2 weeks out and how the Jewish vote will make a difference. As we're convening here today, Americans across the country are already voting. Early voting is open in many key swing states. People are sending in absentee ballots, and volunteers are knocking on doors and calling and texting their fellow Americans to encourage them to make their voices heard. The most important election of our lifetime is not just coming up, it's here, and it ends in 12 days. It's going to take a broad coalition of voters to ensure that we win. Here at JDCA, we have been pursuing a wide range of Jewish voters, Democrats, independents, and even some Republicans, to make the case for why Vice President Kamala Harris is the best choice to lead our country into the future. Our events and messaging have included leading conservatives and liberal leaders speaking from their perspectives from one end of the political spectrum to the other as to why Kamala Harris is best for America, best for Israel, best for the Jewish people, and how she is best for America's leadership role in the world. We know this race is going to be close, and we need your help. To date, JDCA has mobilized thousands of Jewish volunteers, including many of you on this call, who have helped us make more than 1.7 million direct voter engagements. Our ads have reached voters nearly 30 million times, and more than 60,000 people have RSVP'd to our many events and programs this year. To each of you, we say thank you. With only 13 days left in what's projected to be the closest election in the past 60 years, we all can and must do more. With your help, the Jewish vote can make the difference for Kamala Harris and Democrats up and down the ballot. To help us make sense of where the election stands, where it's headed, and what more each of us can do, I'm delighted to introduce today's special guests. I'll start with Simon Rosenberg, who many of you have seen and heard from before. He has spent 3 decades in national media and politics, including on 2 presidential campaigns. Throughout the 2020 midterm elections, Simon dispelled the notion of a so-called, quote, red wave, close quote, and he was correct. He now leads the Hopium Chronicles community. We also have with us Jeremy Ben-Ami, who is the president and founder of J Street. Jeremy's political experience includes serving as deputy domestic political advisor in the Clinton White House and working on several presidential campaigns, including serving with fellow panelist Simon Rosenberg in the 1992 Clinton War Room. And finally, our last special guest is Jim Gerstein, who is one of America's leading experts in Jewish voting patterns and a founding partner of GBAO, a public opinion research organization. Jim has worked as a pollster for various candidate and independent campaigns for U.S. Senate, House, and local elections, as well as organizations, including us at J Street us at JDCA and J Street as well. Thank you all for joining us. I'm now pleased to turn things over to JDCA CEO Halie Soifer to moderate today's conversation. Halie?
Thank you, Ron, and thanks to the hundreds of you who have joined us today to discuss this critically important election and the Jewish vote. As I wrote today in the foreword, and we're going to post that in the chat, when elections are this close, the Jewish vote has an outsized impact, given our relatively high turnout rates, our concentration in key states, and these are the states that will determine the outcome of this election. Jewish Americans show up in higher numbers than the average American voter and are among the most consistently liberal and democratic voters. An average of 3 out of 4 Jewish voters have supported the Democratic presidential candidate in every election since 1992, since that war room, and we're aiming to continue this time-honored tradition this year in 2024 because the stakes have never been higher. Given the staunch support of Democrats that exists among Jewish voters, this election provides us with the opportunity to play a vital role, not just in electing Kamala Harris, who shares our values on every key issue, but also, perhaps just as importantly, in defeating the aspiring dictator on day one, who apparently believes Hitler did some good things, Donald Trump, once and for all, the final time. And make no mistake, the Jewish vote matters in this election. As we see it said on CNN, which just aired in the past hour, Jewish voters are a critical part of a winning Democratic coalition. Our goal is to ensure Democrats who share our values, starting with the Kamala Harris, win in 13 days. So now we're going to turn to Simon Rosenberg to get the latest on the race, including navigating the polls. Simon is an expert who provides us all with hopium on how we're going to win, which we could all use. And it's a special shout out to Simon today because it's not just a little less than 2 weeks before Election Day, but it's also his birthday. So thanks to Simon for joining us and being our source of hopium today of all days on your birthday, Simon. Happy birthday.
So I have a little extra special power in my magic wand today, perhaps. So Halie, thank you. And thank to all of you who are working so hard for our democracy. I've loved our partnership these last few years, and it's been very rewarding for me personally. So thank you. I'm going to make 4 quick points because we've got an amazing group of people to hear from today, including 2 old and dear friends of mine. Number 1, the election's really close. But the polling is not shifting away from us. The polling is actually remarkably steady. The public polling since the debate in early September, Kamala Harris has had a 2, 3, 4-point national lead. That was true last week. It was true 2 weeks ago. It's true this week in the independent polling. And we are in better shape in the battlegrounds than they are, in my view. And what's happened is that there has been, like there was in 2022, an avalanche of right-wing polls that have moved the polling averages, particularly over this past weekend. And if you separate out the independent polling from these red wave right-wing polls, what you see is that we are favored right now and we're in better shape than they are. I mean, just this week, the independent polling that came out when after we were supposedly, the election was drifting away from us, the Morning Consult poll, no movement. The Reuters Ipsos poll, no movement. In a YouGov poll with UMass, we gained 3 points, right? So the independent polling that's come out nationally and in the battleground states, not the red wave polls, actually show the race remarkably consistent and stable over the last 6 weeks, and that we're in better shape than they are, but it's really close. Second, the early vote. The early vote's going to be harder to determine this time. We've made the country is going to vote very differently than during COVID. But as we now have enough votes in enough places to begin to understand what's happening. And right now, we should feel very good about what we're seeing in Michigan, Nebraska, Wisconsin, and now Georgia. We've made significant strides in Georgia in the last few days. And then the rest of the battleground states are just very competitive. But we are doing really well in those 4 states, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Nebraska, based on 2020 numbers and based on comparisons to other states in the country. So the early vote is beginning to look like the early vote that we want, right? And I think the Republicans came out of the gate a little bit strong, whether that's a sign of strength or a sign of them cannibalizing, what's called cannibalizing their election day vote, we're going to find out. But right now, I feel like the early vote data is consistent with the national polling data we have. Third, closing strong. We have a far greater capacity in these 13 days to close stronger than them. We're going to have more ads on the air. Our grassroots is going to reach more people. Our campaign is far more enthusiastically creating a spectacle all across the battlegrounds, reaching media market after media market after media market. I mean, we're going to places like Kalamazoo, right, to go get every vote. And that's part of why what Halie was saying is so important. The campaign strategy right now is they're firing on all cylinders. They are running an extraordinary campaign. The complexity of what they're doing on the ground with these events is amazing to me as a political professional, because they are seeking every Democratic vote they can. They want to win this election by as much as they possibly can. They're going after Republicans. They're going after Jews. They're going after young Black men. They're going after young women, right? Young white women. They're going after everybody. And it's because we need every vote, because the margin, whether we win or not, matters, but also the margin of this election is going to matter for the question of whether or not this has been a clear repudiation of Trump. And we have to match the passion, intensity in this closing days that we're seeing from the campaign and the candidate themselves. Kamala Harris is busting her ass. She is working unbelievably hard. She is campaigning as intensely as any candidate that we've seen in the modern era. And so these guys are bringing it, and we got to match them in the closing days. And I do believe, particularly in the last week, I was on a panel yesterday with a Republican pollster who said in their nightly tracks, they're seeing the election move towards Harris. And that's because the contrast between our hustle, our grit, our fight being everywhere, and the ugliness of Trump in the last week, I think is starting to break through to voters, right? The mismatch between, dancing dipshit Elon and our strong campaign, right, has been remarkable. Finally, if I can just say one thing, is that given the challenges that the Jewish community here in the United States have faced and around the world, and given the clear fascist threat that Donald Trump represents, it is critical that Jews vote. It would be tragic for us if in this time of challenge, there was a sense that Jews didn't rise to that challenge by voting in higher numbers than they have before. So there is a really important, with the work that we're going to hear about today and the work that all of you are doing, it really matters. In this time of enormous challenge, the story has to be there was unprecedented Jewish turnout to rise to this moment, and to meet the moment. It's critical. So the work that you're going to do, the money that you're going to give, everything this amazing team is going to execute in the next 13 days, we got to be there by their side, because the performance of Jews in this election is really going to matter to all of us after November. So Halie, I'm optimistic.
You're optimistic. That's wonderful. We are too. Because I know you are looking at every poll, and you had mentioned specifically the influence of right-wing polls trying to change the polling average. There's the poly market. I know you've written about poly market voodoo.
Yeah.
If you could how should we view polling at this stage? How is the right manipulating the polls? And should we just all get off the polar coaster?
Yeah. I mean, look, the election is close today, and it's going to be close on election day. And there hasn't been any, in my view, there is no clear demonstrable movement away from Harris. I know that if you're reading Nate Silver and you're reading 538 forecast, you saw things tip over towards Trump this weekend. On Wednesday, from Wednesday to Saturday, Republicans dropped 10 polls into the national averages and moved 538's average from 2.6 to Harris to 1.8. And that tipped everything. That movement of 0.8 of a point tipped all the averages. When you hear people say, well, they account for these polls and the averages, no, they don't. That's a lie, right? And what's happened is, the way to think about this is that the good faith efforts by 538 and others to kind of aggregate and make sense of all this disparate data has been hacked by bad faith and malevolent Republicans. They got hacked in 2022 and created a false understanding of the election, the red wave, and they're doing it again. They've released more than 80 polls since the end of August by 31 different organizations. They've mostly focused on Pennsylvania and North Carolina. In October, there have been 31 polls in Pennsylvania. 19 of them are by Republican pollsters or right-aligned pollsters. In North Carolina, it's also a majority since the beginning of September. They've worked the averages to make it look like Trump's winning. And the reason, I think there are 3 reasons why they're doing that, if I can indulge me, Halie. One is that Trump needs, the core narrative of Donald Trump is that he's winning in the polls and he's strong, and Kamala's losing in the polls and she's weak. Trump is using this as a tool to obscure his ugliness, because what he can say is that I may be a rapist, a fraudster, a traitor, and a felon, but I'm leading in the polls and I'm strong. I may be a bigot, a xenophobe, a misogynist, and a racist, but I'm leading in the polls and I'm strong. I may be XXX, right? I may want to end American democracy for all time, end the Western order that's kept us safe, destroy the global economy that's made us prosperous, but I'm leading in the polls and I'm strong, and she's weak. Number 2 is that I think they're using this in particular for their undecideds and their people they're trying to reach, to show that he is strong and he's winning, and it's the bandwagon effect. Third is they're laying the predicate to contest the election. They need to have a map showing them winning. And now I would be willing to bet in polling, just like they were able to convince people that FEMA was stealing money from people in North Carolina and giving it to undocumented immigrants, I'm willing to bet that 80% of their supporters believe Donald Trump's winning the election when he isn't. And so they're conditioning their vote in order to contest the election. And then finally, and most importantly, they wouldn't be going to these extraordinary lengths, 80 polls, 31 different organizations, and so on, if they were winning the election. It is a sign of weakness. When you cheat, it's a sign that you know you're losing. And all of this and other what I call fuckery coming from the right in this election cycle is, again, a signal of their weakness and not their strength. So that's my thoughts.
Okay. Well, your birthday gift to all of us was a hopium.
Yes.
And I think we should all get off that polar coaster and start knocking doors. So I'll
I agree. Do more. We do more, worry less, right? Isn't that true?
Exactly. Because according to Ben Wickler, this race is within the margin of effort.
Yeah.
And we're going to make a greater effort. Thank you, Simon, and happy birthday to you.
Thank you so much.
Jim, more on polling, Jim. You recently conducted a poll through JDCA of battleground state Jewish voters that showed Harris leading Trump in a head-to-head 71-26 with 4% undecided voters. These are essentially the same numbers that we saw in the poll that JDCA conducted in September, which was national. If you could just describe to us where you think the Jewish vote is, and how it compares with previous elections, and if we should expect any variance in terms of what will happen between now and Election Day in terms of the Jewish vote.
Sure. And first of all, thank you for hosting, Halie and Jeremy. It's great to be here with you all, and really a big shout out to the amazing work that both organizations are doing. And to Simon, happy 21st birthday. I hope you are enjoying it. As always, great to hear your analysis. So thank you. With regards to the Jewish vote, I would say there are a few key features to it. First of all, it is a very stable vote, and there are not a lot of undecided voters here. This is a very well-educated constituency that has very firmly held political beliefs and values. What are those beliefs and values? They are liberal. They identify as Democrats. They have a deep distrust and anger toward Trump and the Republicans. His unfavorable rating is over 70%, which makes it impossible for Republicans to make real inroads with Jewish voters. That's not unique to him. It's also true about the Republican Party, and it's been true for a long time. It's not a new Trump phenomenon. I would also say that another piece to what drives the Jewish vote is what is important to Jewish voters, and they are passionate about issues that are closely identified with Kamala Harris's strengths, particularly the future of democracy and abortion rights. Those are the top issues for Jewish voters, and they very firmly want a Democrat in the Oval Office to protect both abortion rights and the future of democracy. Now, we have had a very traumatic year as Jews in the United States, Jews around the world. It has been a horrible year since October 7th, and what happened, the attack on Israel, the aftermath, all sorts of things are going on that would raise a reasonable question of, is something going to be different in this election? Are new events, major events that are traumatic for American Jews, have those things changed anything as how they view politics and how they'll view this election? And we looked at this very carefully over multiple surveys with Jewish voters going back to about a month after October 7th. And we looked at it very carefully, and the answer was very clear that Jews feel more emotionally attached to Israel than they did before, that they have seen that they are concerned about anti-Semitism in the United States, and that it has been a tough year for them. And what all those things happening, they have not changed how they view the Democratic Party and its leadership, and how they view the Republican Party and its leadership. And the vote is strikingly stable. And I think that's for a variety of reasons. Starting with, they agree with Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party's approach to all of these issues far more than they do the Republican Party and Donald Trump. It does not flow that people see anti-Semitism as a rising concern for them. And then they hear Donald Trump say how great he was for Israel and that if Jews don't vote for him, then they hate their religion. That doesn't lead, those two things don't lead somebody to say, you know what, I'm going to change how I view this and vote for Donald Trump. And so there's a lot of chatter out there. There's a lot of talk out there about this. Is this going to be the year that things change? And we've looked at it very carefully. And just as we've seen it every 2 and every 4 years, this is not a year in which we see any evidence of changing patterns in how Jews are approaching this election. So I'm sure there'll be other follow-ups, but that's the core of where I see things based on the many surveys that we've done among Jewish voters over the past year.
Thanks, Jim. Well, we've been getting quite a few thoughts, questions, comments in the chat specifically related to this issue, because in addition to the fact that we see this every 4 years, that Republicans believe this will be the time that they make inroads with Jewish voters, and it never really comes to be, they're investing an extraordinary amount. There's a lot of disinformation targeting Jewish voters this cycle that is aimed at making those inroads. We have someone who says she's seen that projections that Donald Trump will get as high as 90% in this election. What is your prediction based on all that you are seeing in terms of where the Jewish vote will land in this election?
Right. I mean, I'm not in the business of predicting results to a decimal point. I will say that it's very clear that Kamala Harris is performing in the same range as where Democratic candidates for president have performed in the past. If you look back on the polling that we've done on election night with J Street over the past several cycles, what we have seen is that in 2020, President Obama got 70%. In 2012, President Obama got 70%. In 2016, Hillary Clinton got 70%. In 2020, Trump was so uniquely problematic for Jewish voters that Biden rose to 77%. I think it's very clear from our data that Kamala Harris is in that high 60s, low 70s range, and that just very consistent with where Jews have voted in the past. I would also say that she's more popular than Joe Biden in what we've seen in our data. And I think just as we saw a lift nationally in the general population when Kamala Harris became the nominee of about 6 points in general population polls, we actually saw a rise in her vote among the Jewish vote around 6%. And the only difference being that she was starting at a much higher level of support with Jewish voters than among the general population.
One final question that I'm seeing, and we're going to come back for questions for everyone, is what about the Orthodox community? I have a question here about what percentage of the Jewish vote are the Orthodox Jews, and where do they lean?
So the Orthodox population in the United States is about 9% of the Jewish vote. This is according to Pew Research, which has done the gold standard of research among the Jewish population over a couple of major studies in 2013 and 2020. And so it is we have a lot of confidence to say it's right around 9% of the Jewish vote. This minority of a minority is the only demographic in the Jewish population that is Republican, and they're decisively Republican. They're clearly Republican, and they support Trump. We see while Harris performs, in the 80% range among Reform Jews and Jews who don't have a denomination, in this 60% range for Jews who identify their denomination as conservative. Among Orthodox Jews, she's basically in the teens or in terms of her support.
Well, Jim, actually, one more follow-up on that point, because we have seen a lot of polls out there recently that say they're polling Jewish voters. You mentioned the Pew gold standard in terms of the 4 denominations that are out there. Of course, Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, and the 4th, unaffiliated, which is really important. What do you make of some of these polls where the numbers are so different than the polling that you and Pew and others have done?
Haley, I'm so glad you asked me that. I can't tell you the number of emails and texts I get in the morning when some random poll gets released of Jewish that feeds the story. And maybe this is funded by the same network that Simon is talking about the red wave dumps, maybe for other reasons that connect to U.S. foreign policy and how they want America to be approaching it. But for whatever the reason, there is a lot of shoddy polling out there, both of the general population and among the Jewish population. And what I would say to everybody here who I strongly suspect follows these things closely is that when you see something that's billed as a Jewish poll, there's a few things that you want to make sure. One is that it's actually a Jewish poll or poll of Jewish voters, not just a subset in a national poll in which people ask their religion. And why is that so important? It's because the biggest predictor of Jewish voting behavior is their denomination, as we just talked about in your previous question. And polls that don't ask whether somebody is Reform, conservative, Orthodox, or not affiliated with anything, with any denomination, it's completely impossible to assess the quality of that sample. Those samples that are subsets tend to be more Republican because they are not getting a representative Jewish sample. And also because Pew has identified about what they deem to be about 20 to 25% of the Jewish population, that if you're just asked what's your religion, they won't say Judaism. But if you say nothing, or you say agnostic or atheist, they'll say, well, even though you didn't say your religion is Jewish, are you Jewish? Do you consider yourself Jewish? And then you get a whole extra part of the Jewish population that says, yeah, that's me. And that's about 20 to 25%, and that is a very Democratic constituency. And so a lot of these polls that don't ask the screening questions for properly underestimate the Democratic nature of the Jewish population, and so it distorts it. And you can see that pretty clearly in some of these polls and what some of the differences are in some of these polls. So there's a range of things to look at, but I would first start by whether or not this was a truly representative sample of the Jewish population, and reflects kind of Pew's approach to how you sample a Jewish population.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, so I think the conclusion there is again, get off the polar coaster and time to get out and knock doors. Okay, Jeremy, you have been a part of presidential elections going back decades and have seen repeated Republican efforts to politicize support of Israel in many consecutive failed attempts to make inroads with Jewish voters. How do you think this election is similar, and maybe how it's different from what we've seen in the past in terms of Republican campaigns targeting Jewish voters?
Great. Well, let me just start by saying thank you, Haley. It's wonderful to be doing a lot together this cycle. There's a lot of partnership between JDCA and J Street, and a lot of shared values and certainly shared politics. And so it's just great to be with you. And thank you for everything that you and Ron and the whole team are doing. And happy birthday to my friend Simon. Very exciting. You continue to try to catch up to me in age, but you always just fall a little short. Sorry about that. But it's just, 1 year, make that extra year up at some point. So it's great to be here. Look, this is a playbook that you and I both know well. You've been at this for a little while too, and your counterpart at the RJC, has been around as long as I have. And every single cycle there is something that they are seeking to use to trigger a reaction, sort of a more tribal reaction that they believe is out there among Jews, whether it is fear of presidential candidate whose middle name is Hussein, or it is a sense that a Democratic administration is giving away the store to the mullahs in Tehran, or fear of an Iranian nuclear weapon. There's always something to put $10 million of Miri Medelson's money behind and to run those ads. And really, it doesn't seem to matter whether there's a war, whether it's anti-Semitism on campus, whether it's Iran, whether it's the nature of the candidate. There's always some attempt to stir up the internal fear and hope that type of a campaign will overcome the very basic value set that Jim was talking about, that really is what powers the American Jewish vote. The reason why there is no chance of really a significant shift in the Jewish vote is because of the core values that American Jews hold and the things that they are voting for and the things that motivate them, are fundamental. And it's why the unfavorability of Donald Trump, of Mitt Romney, of even John McCain, of Mitch McConnell. I mean, you can just go down the list of every single Republican figure. And by the way, I'll just throw in Bibi Netanyahu, that if you add in Netanyahu, his numbers are just like a Republican. And so it is very, very hard for them to use that kind of fear mongering with the 70% of Jewish Americans who hold these fundamentally liberal and democratic values. And so, yes, Biden got to 77, but as Jim said, 70 was the number in 2016. 70 was the number in 2012. If you average the Democratic vote over every single presidential election since they started doing election night polling, the number 70. It's amazing. That is exactly the number. And it's precisely where I think we're going to end up yet again for all of the agita, and of all of the money that's being spent. And I've seen this movie over and over and over again. And yes, it has the same ending. Now, having said that, I will acknowledge that 2024 is different, right? We have never held one of these elections in the middle of this kind of environment, in the middle of this war, in the middle of this rise in anti-Semitism. And I do think that the circumstances around us are different. And so Jim is appropriately hesitant to put himself out there and say precisely what the number is going to be. And I won't do that either. But I do think that we have a lot of precedent to go on, and I don't think that there's going to be much difference in the outcome.
Yeah, and on that note, I would just remind everyone, and we've seen this in poll after poll, that the top two issues for Jewish voters remain unchanged, even in this year, which is quite different. And it's the defense of our democracy, and it is abortion access. 88% of Jews believe abortion should be legal in all or some cases. So this is an issue that transcends the partisan divide in our community, and those continue to drive the Jewish vote. But even for those Jewish voters who are increasingly focused and voting on the issue of Israel, that is a reason to support Kamala Harris, because time and again, she has demonstrated her staunch support of the U.S.-Israel relationship. There has been more military aid given by this administration in the past year by an exponential amount to Israel in the aftermath of October 7th, $17.8 billion. They've twice moved U.S. military assets and troops to defend Israel against unprecedented direct Iranian attacks. So that is a reason to support Kamala Harris. So in addition to the presidential election, and we can post some talking points as well in the chat for those looking to still convince those undecided voters, and they're out there. I met one recently, and I've tried to convince them. If he's on this call, we'll talk more. But in addition to the presidential election, we're focused as well on ensuring that Democrats win for the Senate and the House, that we hold the Democratic majority in the Senate and that we flip the House from red to blue, making Hakeem Jeffries the next Speaker of the House. So Jeremy, talk a bit about what you're seeing in terms of this election and the Jewish vote when it comes to Congress.
Absolutely. I just want to add one word, since Israel is the topic that J Street does spend the majority of its time talking about and working on. I just want to second some of the things that you said, Halie, and add one little bit, which is that I think there's been a few questions in the chat, and I know that it's part of the Jewish conversation, that there's a part of the American Jewish community that is also a little bit upset at the fact that the American support for Israel hasn't been qualified and hasn't had limits and hasn't had an impact on the way in which Israel has persecuted and prosecuted the war. And so I just want to add that I think the way that Kamala Harris has gone about talking about the issues in a very balanced manner, in which she has emphasized that one can't support Israeli security without also supporting Palestinian rights and the road to self-determination ultimately for the Palestinian people. That kind of a balanced approach also speaks to the overwhelming majority of Jewish Americans. That is the pro-Israel kind of approach that I think will help speak not only to some who are, thinking more about the security side of the equation, but also to the younger voters that are being mentioned in the chat, people's children and grandchildren, who are also concerned about Palestinian rights. And so I think that the Harris-Walz campaign has it right. And I think our talking points, need to include that balance to be able to speak to all of the community, not just one part of the community. In terms of House and Senate races, the most significant race in the nation, I think, is in Montana. I don't know if Simon and Jim have some further polling recently. That was not looking so good because that's sort of the 50th seat in the Senate. But if you have to choose one state to really focus in on, Montana certainly is that state for Senate control. If that is a losing race, then the question becomes, is it possible for Colin Allred to pull things out in Texas? Again, I'm seeing some numbers recently that show that that race is tightening. There's a significant lag between Cruz and Trump. And Cruz is a uniquely, you think Trump is unpopular. Cruz is uniquely unpopular, even in his home state of Texas. So I think that Texas is the state that one has to look to if one is looking to some math that allows you to get to 50-50. The other wild card in all of this, of course, is Nebraska. And what happens there with Deb Fischer and the independent candidate. And I think that is a wild card to keep our eye on closely on election night. Around the country in House races, there's a whole slew of very, very tight races. I think it comes down to about 20 to 25 races around the country. One has to just simply look at the cooked toss-ups, but I think that there are races that are emerging at the last minute. I think there's one that we've just gotten involved in Arizona, where Jonathan Nez, the former head of the Navajo Nation, is challenging a Republican incumbent named Crane. And that is a pretty solidly Republican seat till now. But the fact that the former head of the Navajo Nation is running as a Democrat is goosing a very active field operation and turnout in a district that might not normally be in play. So Arizona too is a really, good one to keep an eye on. Obviously, there are, very important races in New York State, not exactly a swing state, but there's 3 or 4 key races in New York that are going to come down to the wire. There's a couple of races in Wisconsin and Michigan that are also right down to the wire. And the balance in the House is going to turn, much as in the presidential election, on a handful of states where you've had some redistricting and some realignment of a handful of districts that may allow the Democrats to get across the line in the House. So that's the quick take on it.
Great. Well, I'm actually interested, Jim, going back to you, specifically your take on where things stand in terms of the Senate and the House. And we did get a question about younger Jewish voters, if you could speak to that as well in terms of the youth vote and its importance when it comes to the Jewish vote.
Sure. So I would start by saying I think Jeremy outlined it very clearly and accurately in terms of the where things stand in the Senate and the House. I would make a point about Texas. Full disclosure, Colin Allred is one of our clients, but I think this is a fascinating race that is very, very close, and would note for folks that in Texas, 8.5 million people voted in 2016 for president, and 11 million voted for president in Texas in 2020. So a 2.5 million person increase. And we saw that the margin went from +9 Republican to +5.5 Republican between those two waves. Texas is a very dynamic state. I think that is and in addition to Cruz being a uniquely awful person or candidate, Colin Allred is a uniquely special and talented and amazing. And I encourage folks to look at that. There are other, the House is also, I think there may be some surprises in various districts across the country. We're doing the polling for the DCCC battleground, and I can just say that we have several seats that we can pick up, and they may be a little bit off the radar because they're not in presidential swing states. As Jeremy noted, some of them, they're actually in some pretty blue states as well, or blue districts in red states. And so I think that's very interesting. I think just as we have a very close election at the presidency, we do in the Senate and we do in the House. And it is, every vote is going to matter, to go back to the original theme of what you were saying earlier, Halie. In terms of the younger Jewish vote, it's very interesting. It's a fascinating piece of the Jewish electorate. They are voting for Kamala Harris more than any other age group, but they also have a lot of mixed feelings over what's been going on over the past year. They tend to think anti-Semitism. They are not as concerned about anti-Semitism as older generations. They're not as concerned about anti-Semitism on college campuses as older generations. It's not to say they don't care about it or they're not interested. It's not as pressing or as concerning to them as it is for their parents or their grandparents. They also have expressed more hesitancy and concern about how much the U.S. has supported Israel's conduct in the war. I mean, they're very emotionally attached to Israel. They care about Israel. Their attachment to Israel rose higher than any other age group after October 7th. But that doesn't mean that they can't hold two thoughts at once, just like the rest of the Jewish population, of wanting to support Israel and being horrified by what happened on October 7th, but also being concerned about what they see happening on TV in Gaza. And so they take all this together and express their concerns, their hesitations, and are still the strongest voting bloc for Kamala Harris within the Jewish population by age. And ultimately, they just are very liberal and very focused on abortion rights and democracy and climate change, actually, and like the rest of the population, kind of loathe Donald Trump and what he stands for.
Great. Thank you, Jim. And I would just say that JDCA, I know J Street as well, is very invested in younger voters. We're proud to have 46 campus fellows getting out the vote on their campuses, especially in those battleground states, which is so important. Simon, back to you. I thought perhaps you would be the best one to address this question. And to be clear, we're taking questions now from the chat. We had someone say, I've read some things about Harris going too negative with her words on Trump. Is this going to have an impact? Now, we've talked a bit about, is it better to be on the defense or the offense? And I think that nobody makes the case against Trump more clearly and succinctly than you have repeatedly in your case about you'd rather be us than them. But if you could talk about that, and especially why going on the offense may actually be a winning strategy when it comes to independent voters. Oh, you're muted.
I don't have access to the campaign research, and this campaign's probably done more research than any campaign in history. So I'm now going to be operating from a place of opinion and not, being driven by data. I think that part of the reason that Kamala Harris surged the way she did after the change happened was this basic opening statement she had every time she spoke, where she said, you know me as a vice president and as a senator, but before then I was a prosecutor and I was an attorney general, and that I know people like Donald Trump and I prosecuted them successfully. And I think this was so important for her to sort of establish that she could defeat him, that she wasn't intimidated by him, that she was strong and she put people in jail, and that she could manage people like Donald Trump. And I think that I think that what they know in terms of the close, right? Yes, we have to make our case for how we're going to make America better and all these things. But I think when I got asked yesterday in a presentation I gave, why do I think things are as close as they are? And I think because we once again kind of failed to make the definitive indictment of Trump. I think that, we still haven't totally figured out how to express the danger that he is. And I think that, so two things I would say. One is that I think the indictment of him is essential in these closing weeks. And, we have to be on two tracks, right? We have to be making our case for what we want to do. And we have to, like every campaign, and remind people about why the other guy's not so good, right? And I think that what's changed, my own sort of, I've come to believe that what's changing in the election right now is that they're now sort of reminding voters about his unhinged behavior and his craziness. It matters now. It's for whatever reason, you never know in a campaign, right? When things break through that, I talked to a good friend of ours, JB Persh, Jim, 10 days ago, who told me in their groups in the Senate Majority PAC that Trump's unhinged behavior was starting to come up unprompted in the focus groups, that this was a change, and they were coming up frequently, and that there was legitimate concerns that people had about his capacity to do the job, whether he was fit. Well, the campaign clearly saw that too, because in that following Monday is when Kamala really started, hitting him hard for being unfit, unhinged, all the words she's used, right? And all the unwords that she's used. And so I think that we need to do both, right? We need to make the positive case, and we need to continue to hit him as hard as we possibly can, because he is the most dangerous figure in American political history with no near peer. And that it is our obligation to tell the American people this. It's our obligation to inform the American people about his ruinous economic policies, his ruinous security strategies, his ruinous, his willingness to become a fascist dictator and end American democracy, his willingness to make the lives of women even worse than they are today. All these things are fair game. And I will say that when Kamala Harris wins, I think one of the central reasons she is going to win is that she's done a better job in indicting Trump than any other Democratic politician in the last 9 years. And it's in part, I think it's possible that her experience as a prosecutor gave her tools and confidence to take him down that other politicians may not have had. And so I also just want to delight in what happened with Rudy Giuliani yesterday, if I can just do that for a second, which is that Rudy was ordered by a judge to turn over all of his assets, his penthouse apartment in New York, his fancy cars, all of his resources, to the two women that he defamed in Georgia, who are now going to be owners of one of the most expensive apartments in New York City next week. And it's a reminder of the criminality, the malevolence, that the Star Wars bar nature of MAGA, that Rudy Giuliani at this moment, at this critical moment, will be stripped of all that he owns, including the place that he lives, in the next 7 days. And, I don't know how you all feel about it, but I feel, I think it makes me feel good, to be honest. And so that's my answer, Halie.
Thank you. Yeah, the Star Wars bar is it's an interesting image of Steve Bannon and
Yeah.
Steve Miller, and you can just picture them all there.
The MAGA Star Wars bar.
Yeah, it's actually quite frightening.
Yeah.
Okay, so the final question, and we'll ask for everyone to give a short answer. People seem pumped. They're ready to go. So what is the most impactful thing that supporters can do to get out the vote and have the biggest impact in these final 13 days? Simon, we'll start with you. What do you
I'll
advise?
be quick. Well, work with you, and bolster your operation, channel it through what you're doing. It's a very smart and savvy program that you have. And I think just whatever you all do, right? Whether it's writing more checks or making more calls or, canvassing for those that you like to canvass, you just got to do more, right? You just got to do more. I mean, part of what happens, the whole do more, worry less concept is not just an effective strategy. It's also a mental health strategy, right? It's also a way of self-preservation, which is that when you sit around and worry, it's not good. So don't do it, right? Don't worry. Don't go to worry, go to work and do more. And so one way to channel the rising anxiety that exists in the family is to do more work and to channel that into good works, and start with working with Halie and whatever she asks you to do.
Great. And we're gonna send follow-up as well. And I've seen in the chat questions about, do we have canvases? Do we have phone banks? Do we have text banks? We've got it all. So yes. Jeremy, what is your answer for how people can have the biggest impact in these final days?
So absolutely proud to be partnering with you in so many different ways and doing get out the vote work, canvassing, et cetera. J Street's also extremely active. We've got all sorts of campus work going. We've got all our own canvassing going as well. So plug into any organization, all organizations, everything you can do. There's one other thing I did want to put on the table, though, which is this set of electronic tools that are out there for relational organizing. It's a new concept to some people, particularly people who have been doing politics for decades and decades and are used to, just getting on a phone or knocking on a door. But the single best way to influence someone's vote is to have it be somebody, the messenger be somebody that they know, a trusted friend, family member, a figure of respect in their community, but people that they already know. And there are all sorts of new tools out there, things like Reach, which is an app that the campaign has been using, Swipe Blue. Just Google the term relational organizing, do a little digging into what is a app and a system that may work for you. It takes a look at your contacts. It sees who's registered to vote according to voter rolls in the key swing states. It helps you figure out who you need to be in touch with, who may have kids and grandkids that are in schools in those places. It's an incredibly powerful tool, and it allows you to put some time into directly reaching people that you may be 1 degree of separation from or 2, and have a direct influence on people in the swing states, as opposed to sort of the random stuff that we do. We go out there, we knock the doors, we ring, make the texts and the phone calls, but we don't know the people we're contacting. This is a different approach to that, and I'm very convinced that this is exceedingly important in such a tight election. So check out the term relational organizing and some of the apps that are out there that are making that possible in 2024.
Yeah, and if people don't want to download the app, the concept behind it is that you can have the biggest influence in your network, whether it's your kids or your parents or your grandparents or your cousins or your friends or your neighbors or your, college roommate. You're the one who can impact them perhaps the most than hearing from someone they don't know who's knocking on their door. So it's whether it's posting on Facebook or Instagram about why you're supporting Kamala Harris in this election, or going on one of these apps and doing the relational organizing, which you should and could do as well. It's about conveying this message to everyone you know, and also about the importance of voting, just making sure that people get out there and vote. Jim, same question.
I think in the next 13 days, we need to drop everything and put everything into this. I echo everything that Simon and Jeremy said in terms of connecting with JDCA, J Street, apps, campaigns. It all matters. I look at this as we've got 7 elections, and when it comes to the presidency, we have 7 elections in 7 different states, and they are razor thin, and everything people do matters. And when I've talked with people who knocked on a door and convinced somebody who was on the fence to vote for Harris, it is like joy for them beyond. I mean, it is amazing. And I think if you are focused on Jewish voters, turn them out. For every Jewish person who turns out, where there's 70% plus chance they're going to be voting for Kamala Harris. And if they're younger and they're the younger voters are less motivated to vote, we need them to get out, because they're even more likely to vote for Kamala Harris. So, and if you are working with the general population, it is talk to people about why it is so important for you that they vote for Kamala Harris. And good luck to everybody. We have 13 days left, 13 days where we can work our tails off.
Okay, Simon had one more thing to add, especially because it's his birthday. Last Simon.
I also, consistent with what Jeremy said, I want to talk about the negative of that, which is that resist sharing scary things with friends in these 13 days. Resist, don't hit send. Don't go to an email and send it to 50 of your friends saying, did you see this? And take your anxiety and your worry and throwing it through your networks. It isn't helpful. It's not constructive. Be more disciplined, right? End the election with joy and confidence and power, and don't end with worry and fear. And I think this is something that is particularly important right now, where keep your worry to yourself, do more, worry less. Don't export your worry through your networks. Export confidence and power and winning. And that's what we enjoy. That's how we have to close here. And I think that we're all a little too prone to just send that simple email to your friend saying, did you see this? Not knowing whether it's actually important, not knowing whether it's really happening, not knowing if it really matters, but just, did you see this? Try to send as few of those as you possibly can, and send the ones which is, did you see how great we're doing in the early vote in Michigan? Or did you see how that amazing appearance by Kamala Harris last night? Or did you see Governor Walz calling Elon Musk a dipshit, right? Which is one of my favorite moments in the campaign. Send those, don't send the other ones. It's my final parting thought. Thank you, Halie.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks to our panelists for joining us today. We're going to turn it over for a wrap up from Bobby Saferstein, our Director of Programming, our Chief Program Officer. Bobby, over to you to tell everyone what they can be doing in these final few days.
Thank you, Halie. Thanks to Jeremy, thanks to Simon, thanks to Jim, and all of you for joining us today. If today's conversation has made one thing clear, the Jewish vote can and will make a difference in this year's election. And each of us can and will make a difference in how many Jewish voters turn out to vote. We have just 13 days to ensure that when we wake up on the morning of November 6th, we will know that we have done everything we can to protect our democracy, to defend our freedoms, and build a better, safer, and more prosperous future for our country, our families, our Jewish communities, Israel, and for the world by electing Vice President Kamala Harris as our next president, and by electing Democrats across the country who share our Jewish and democratic values. Now is the time to get involved. Now is the time to make a difference. Now is the time to take action. To do so with JDCA, please visit jewishdems.org/do something. To sign up to Phone Bank, Text Bank, and Canvas with us now until the end of the election. While there, we also encourage you to join one of our state and local chapters and affiliates, make a financial contribution to support our work, and join our future programs and events like this. To join our canvases in key swing states, such as Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, and key swing districts in California and New York, please click on the link in the chat. We have a slate of extra special opportunities to join us on the ground in Michigan and Pennsylvania this weekend and next, so please do sign up, and we'll send you everything you need to travel with us and knock on doors to help close the margins. Next Wednesday, October 30th at 5 p.m., please join us as we kick off our final push to get out the Jewish vote with our last big virtual rally of the season, Last Call to Save Democracy. We'll be joined by elected officials, celebrities, thought leaders, and a surprise or two as we thank our volunteers and get energized to finish the 2024 election strong. You don't want to miss it. Please sign up at the link in the chat. With just 13 days left in this year's election cycle, we want to thank you for taking action with us. Wishing each of you a Chag Sameach. Now let's get out there and win. Thank you. See you soon.